everyone, my name is Rachel. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am bringing you guys some audiobook recommendations. Now, I have done this format of a video before, but it's been, I want to say, almost 2 years since I did that original video. That will of course be linked up in the cards above, which is weird because I adore audiobooks. Most of the books that I read, I listen to the audiobook while following along with the physical book. So yes, I have plenty of audiobooks to recommend to you guys, but like I said, definitely reference that first video that I made for even more recommendations. So without further ado, let's just get into it. I'm going to start by talking about books that I don't have physical copies of. So the first one I want to mention is The Night Swim by Megan Golden. The narrators for this were Bailey Carr and January Lavoie. January Lavoie is one of the best audiobook narrators out there. She's absolutely incredible. I'm gonna get to another series that she narrated that is just incredible later on in the video. Also, I just want to point out in this video, I'm not going to be delving too deeply into the plots of these books because I really just want to focus on the quality of the audiobooks themselves. But this one is very interesting because we have our main character Rachel, who is the host of a true crime podcast. And so what's amazing about this audiobook is that there are excerpts from that podcast throughout the book, and you really feel like you are actually listening to a true crime podcast. Like I said, the narrators did a really great job. You really feel like you are immersed in this court case and in this true crime and all of that. Even though this is a fictional story, it just feels so real. Next book I want to recommend is Concrete Rose by Angie Thomas. The audiobook narrator for this was Dion Graham. I have definitely heard his voice before in other audiobooks, but this one stands out so much to me in my mind because I feel like Dion perfectly captured Maverick's character. It is all from Maverick Carter's point of view, who was Star's father from The Hate U Give. You might recall that. This book actually came out pretty recently and I read it probably a week or so ago. I actually talked about this book quite a bit in my mid-month wrap-up, so that will also be linked up in the cards above. But yeah, Dion Graham is a phenomenal narrator. His voice just perfectly fit the character. I also think he did a really great job with giving different voices to all of the other different characters in the book. So yes, cannot recommend enough going the audiobook route for this book. Okay, this video is going to be all over the place because I have books that span so many different genres. The next audiobook that I want to mention is A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. This is an Audible original audiobook, and this has a full cast of characters. I raved about this audiobook so much in my 'Tis the Season-a-thon reading vlog that I did back in December. And what is so incredible about this audiobook is that not only is there a full cast of narrators and characters, but they also just did a phenomenal job with different sound effects. You can literally hear doors opening and closing, chains against the ground because of Marley, the first ghost that Scrooge meets. You know, he's got these chains all over his body, and so as he's walking around the room, you can literally hear the chains, and it's really creepy. This audiobook just does an incredible job of creating the perfect atmosphere for this story. Definitely can't recommend enough going the route of this particular audiobook if you are interested in reading the original story of A Christmas Carol. Next up is Heidi's Guide to Four-Letter Words by Tara Civic and Andy Arndt. So Andy Arndt is an audiobook narrator. She narrates this audiobook as well. And what I love about this audiobook, this is also an Audible original, is that our main character Heidi also creates her own podcast. What's so fun about this is that we hear her having issues with like the sound equipment and what she wants to say, what she wants this podcast to be. You know, you're truly along for the ride with Heidi in terms of her creating this podcast. She gets laid off from her teaching job, and so she gets a job at an audiobook recording company where they only record very smutty romances, and she's very scandalized by that. So she decides to create this podcast where she will read excerpts from the sex scenes in romance novels to get herself more comfortable with the subject matter and to also get herself more comfortable with her own sexuality. Yeah, it's a fun time. It's also really funny. I adore Tara Civic's sense of humor. Okay, so now to get into the very big stack of physical books that I own. The next book that I want to recommend is Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo. I've talked about Elizabeth Acevedo's books before in my first audiobook recommendations video because She narrates her own books. I've listened to both The Poet X and With the Fire on High by her. Her voice is just so perfect for capturing her own stories and her own characters. I wouldn't want anybody else to narrate her books, but in the case of this book, this is about our two main characters, Camino and Yahaira, and they are from very different backgrounds. One of them lives in the Dominican Republic, the other one lives in New York City, I think Brooklyn. And so essentially they find out that they are half sisters. They have the same father. And so this is a novel that's written in verse, just like The Poet X, and that's one of the things that I really loved about this, but also the narration of having Elizabeth Acevedo. And then the narrator for Camino was Melania Luisa Marte. I think that's how her name is pronounced. And again, both of their voices just fit these two characters so well. Next up, I quickly want to talk about two books by TJ Klune that I read pretty recently and absolutely loved. And the first one is The Extraordinaries. This is book 1 in the Extraordinaries series. This is a YA series, by the way. We have our main character, Nick. He's gay. He also has ADHD. He writes fan fiction about this superhero, Shadowstar. They live in a world where superheroes exist. And the narrator for this audiobook was Michael Leslie. What I loved about his narration is that he perfectly captured the campiness of this story. I love that TJ Klune really plays into the camp of superheroes in general, and it just is such a fun world that he has created. And Michael Leslie just also does a really great job of giving different voices to all of the different characters, not only our main character Nick, but also the voices of the superheroes themselves and Nick's father and all of that. It's just a phenomenal audiobook. The other book by TJ Klune that I quickly want to mention, I promise I won't talk about this one too long, is The House in the Cerulean Sea, which was my top favorite book of 2020. And the narrator for this one, let me see, was Daniel Henning. And I adored his narration because this is a story all about these 6 very different and diverse magical children that live in this house in the Cerulean Sea. It's an orphanage for magical children. And the different voices that Daniel Henning gives to not only the 6 children, but the adults as well, like, you would almost think that this book was narrated by multiple narrators because that's how good of a job he did with this audiobook. Next, we've got a couple of indie published adult romances. First, I want to mention From Lukov with Love by Marina Zapata. The audiobook is narrated by Callie Dalton and Teddy Hamilton. Teddy Hamilton is probably my top favorite male narrator for romance novels. Like, his voice is so sweet, but yet so sexy at the same time. He also narrates under a different name for like the Bromance Book Club series, but most of his audiobooks are under the Teddy Hamilton name. And what's interesting about this audiobook is that Teddy Hamilton only narrates the lines of dialogue from Ivan, who is the hero of this story. Callie Dalton narrates literally everything else, but for the lines of dialogue of Ivan's, Teddy Hamilton comes in. I've never really listened to an audiobook with that kind of format before. So yeah, of course, highly recommend this. This was also one of my top favorite romances of 2020. And just to give you a little bit of a synopsis, is about our main characters, Jasmine and Ivan. Like I mentioned earlier, they are both figure skaters, they are both pair skaters, and both of their partners leave them for different reasons, and so they end up having to partner together. It's definitely an enemies to friends to lovers romance. It's absolutely everything. And then another adult romance audiobook that I adore is Marriage for One by Ella Mays. The narrators are Stella Bloom and Lance Greenfield. I had never listened to an audiobook that Lance Greenfield had done, but man, was his voice perfection for Jack, our hero. Jack is a very broody man, and Lance just like perfectly captured that, and he also just has a very deep and sexy voice. I was so here for it. I also felt that Stella perfectly captured Rose's voice because it's definitely a Grump Sunshine trope, and Rose is a little bit of a quirky character, and I think that Stella did a really great job with that. By the way, this is also a very chunky romance. It's 500 pages, also one of my top favorite romances of 2020, and this is a contemporary romance that is a marriage of convenience. Next is a book by Sarah J. Maas that I feel like not enough people have read or not enough people talk about, because I think it's a really great book. And that is Catwoman Soulstealer. So this is book 3 in the DC Icon series that various different authors wrote for. There is a Wonder Woman book that Leigh Bardugo wrote. There's a Batman one that Marie Lu wrote. So as you can tell from the title, this is about Selina Kyle, who is Catwoman. It is her origin story, but it also is about how she ends up collaborating with both Poison Ivy and Harley Quinn, and how all 3 of them are going up against Batwing. It is just such a fun time, such a great book. But the audiobook. So the narrator is Julia Whalen. She narrates quite a few audiobooks, and again, she just has the perfect voice for Selina Kyle, for Catwoman. She has this kind of like deeper and more sultry voice, and it just fits the character really, really well. But yes, highly, highly, highly recommend going the audiobook route if you're going to check out this book. It's such a fun time. I low-key wish that this would become a series, because I think that Sarah J. Maas writes her character and this world really well. Next up is quite a bit of a different book than Catwoman. This is My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. So Grace Gummer is the narrator for this one. Again, she perfectly captured the voice and the character of our main character, Vanessa. This is a very dark literary fiction novel, by the way, about our main character who is coming to terms with the fact that a relationship that she had with her English teacher when she was in high school was toxic and abusive. And like I said, Grace Gummer did a fantastic job. But what I also loved about this audiobook is that I think the last 30 minutes or so of the audiobook was an interview with both Grace Gummer and Kate Elizabeth Russell about the audiobook and also the book in general. I think that it's a fantastic interview. Next, we have another contemporary adult romance. This is Vicious by L.J. Shen. This is book 1 in her Sinners of Saints series, also the best book of the series, and in my opinion, the only book that you need to read, because I read the other books in the series and they were fine, but not nearly as good as this one. We have our narrators, Christian Rummel and Savannah Peachwood, and both of them do a really great job with their characters, but Christian in particular just like knows how to sound like an asshole. This is a new adult bully romance, by the way, that I didn't think I was going to love, but I was obsessed from page 1. Yeah, I don't really know what to say. I feel like Christian Rummel just really understood Vicious's character, but also Savannah Peachwood did a really great job with Amelia's character as well. Next is a book that I didn't really love, if I'm being honest with you guys, and I'm always honest with you guys, but I can't deny how amazing the audiobook is, and that is Red Rising by Pierce Brown. Don't get me wrong, I didn't hate this book. I gave it 4 stars, but upon further reflection after reading this about a month ago, I'm just left feeling conflicted about this book. Definitely check out, I want to say it was my end of January wrap up where I talked about this one. I'll definitely link that up in the cards above. However, the narrator, let me see if I can find his name, Tim Gerard Reynolds. Okay, he did a fantastic job with essentially the different dialects and accents that are required with this story, because essentially this takes place in a futuristic society on the planet Mars. We have a caste system. The highest caste is gold, the lowest is red. Darrow starts out the story as a red, so the narrator has to speak in a very different accent when he is a red and when there's other red characters around him, but then he essentially gets elevated and transformed into a gold, and so he has to take on a completely different accent for that as well, and I just think that he really did a great job with the narration for this. Next up, I have to recommend the Renegades series by Marissa Meyer. The narrators for this are Rebecca Soler and Dan Bittner, both phenomenal narrators. Rebecca Soler, she has also narrated books such as Sadie by Courtney Summer. Again, fantastic job. She's also one of my top favorite narrators. I would say Rebecca Soler and January Lavoie are my top narrators for sure. And so what's so amazing about both of their performances in this audiobook, basically Rebecca Soler does Nova's point of view and Dan Bittner does Adrian's point of view, and they both do a fantastic job of giving very unique voices to all of the different characters in this world, because this is also a superhero story, and both the Renegades, which are the heroes of this world, and the Anarchists, which are the villains, they all have very unique voices, especially the ones that are more villainous, as you would expect from this kind of story. As much as I feel like this isn't a perfect series by any means, I still highly recommend it because I think that it is a superhero story done really well. Okay, not gonna lie, my last two recommendations are very basic audiobook recommendations, but when I listened to these audiobooks and read these books, I mean, I just knew that these were some of the best audiobooks out there. So the first one that I'm going to recommend is the Illuminae Files by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff. This is a trilogy of sci-fi thrillers. They're YA books, by the way. All of the audiobooks are narrated by a completely full cast of narrators. And when I tell you full cast, like, it sounded like there were at least 12 different narrators, because there were some scenes where there had to be voices piling on top of each other and it sounded like so many people. It was absolutely crazy. It takes place on this ice planet in the beginning where there is illegal mining going on. This evil corporation called Baytech decides to attack this colony to get rid of everybody who's living there because they just want to take it over for themselves. And so everybody flees to, I want to say, like 3 different like huge spaceships to try to get away from Baytech. And things just go south very quickly. There is a virus going around that turns people into like zombies, essentially. There's also the AI that controls one of the ships that goes kind of crazy. There's just a lot going on, and I cannot recommend enough listening to the audiobook at the same time while following along with the physical book, because there is a multimedia aspect to it. We get transcriptions of surveillance footage, we get IM conversations, we get passages of the AI itself. My very last recommendation is for another January Lavoie series, and that is The Diviners by Libba Bray. So January Lavoie narrates all 4 books in this series. By the way, this is a YA paranormal historical fiction series, takes place in the 1920s. January Lavoie is another one of those narrators that when you're listening to the audiobooks, it sounds like there has to be multiple narrators, because that's how distinctive she makes all of the different characters' voices. Because we have a very diverse cast of characters, because there are characters of all different races and all different ages involved. There's supernatural things going on, so she definitely has to give like very creepy voices to the creepy characters and things like that. I could go on and on and on about this series. Right, guys, that's going to be it for this audiobook recommendations video. Definitely leave a comment below if you want to tell me your favorite audiobooks. I always love getting recommendations for you guys. And yeah, with that being said, I would love it if you would leave a like and subscribe, and I thank you in advance if you do, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!